The first key topic in regard to abolitionism in the 1800s is the rise of Black abolitionists and their subsequent effects on social inequity in the United States. During the 1850s, almost 250,000 African Americans were victims of horrible living conditions and social inequity, and thus lived in relative poverty, were constant victims of mob violence, and received very little opportunities to education, and thus were very limited in their occupations later on in life. Thus, some Northern Blacks lived in even worse living conditions than their Southern counterparts who lived as slaves. However, there was a fundamental difference between Northern and Southern Blacks, in that Northerners enjoyed freedom and thus understood that emancipation was only going to be a true universal value when the Southerners were also freed. Thus, the values of emancipation and abolition became very key to the abolition movement during this time period, as more and more people began to seek freedom for slaves. The abolition movement had two drastically polarized points of view. The first enjoyed more violent overthrows and more violent protests, while the second point of view subscribed to more peaceful schools of thought. However, despite these different ideals, African Americans united under the great orator of the time, Frederick Douglass, who founded the Abolition Paper, the North Star, and other great literary works. He advocated not only for the emancipation of Blacks across the country, but also social and economic equality, and thus Douglass would spearhead the Black abolitionist movement. The second key topic in regard to abolitionism was the rise of anti-abolitionists as a response to the political momentum that the abolition movement was gaining. Almost all white Southerners, as well as many Northern whites, feared this movement. The movement was considered dangerous and a threat to the social system in place at that time, largely because the critics warned that the movement would not only produce an influx of free Blacks to the North, but also rising tensions and even war between sections in America. Thus, there was a large escalation in violence against abolitionists in the 1830s. A private school in Connecticut, for example, was shut down due to the overwhelming response to the integration of Blacks in the school system. Another very important sanctuary, the Temple of Liberty in Philadelphia, which was an abolitionist headquarters, was burned down by a mob. Even more so, several key leaders and people such as Garrison and Lovejoy became direct targets of other violent acts. Very clearly, the anti-abolitionist mobs were some of the most violent groups in this time period. However, the political commitment that abolitionists had made to their campaign was very strong-willed and passionate, and despite these acts of hatred, the movement continued. The third key topic in regard to abolition in the 1800s was the rise of division within the movement itself. By the 1830s, abolition had begun to experience internal divisions not only because of its more violent approach, but also because of the increasing radicalism of key leaders. For example, some certain groups enjoyed using violent resistance as a method to gain the goals of abolition, while others used political action. For example, John Brown received funding to stage violent resistance efforts, while Weld and Grimke spread anti-slavery propaganda to garner support. On the other hand, there was Garrison and his followers. While they became more radical, others enjoyed a much more moderate approach which advocated for the peaceful and long-term efforts, and thus supported efforts like the Underground Railroad. Furthermore, legal action began to be taken. For example, in the Supreme Court case Prigg v. Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court ruled that states couldn't help return fugitive slaves to their owners. Furthermore, abolitionists pushed Congress to take action by banning slavery in federally controlled areas like the District of Columbia and prohibiting domestic slave trade. However, Congress felt that their efforts had to be limited because of certain rights that they didn't necessarily have. Because of all of this political momentum in the 1800s, the influence of the abolition movement was very widespread. For example, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became wildly popular and popularized the anti-slavery message, especially through recreations of the novel in theaters, and thus portrayed slaves as innocent victims of a very violent and oppressive system. And thus, despite all of the opposition and all the factions formed, abolition remained a very powerful influence in the 1800s with widespread consequences.